Okay, welcome to the next installment of our cutting room floor videos. These short videos where we're giving you a little extra, didn't make a cut on a Sunday morning sermon. Also just giving you what I think are helpful little tidbits as you're working your way through the book of Revelation, trying to read it and make sense of it for yourselves. Again, because apocalyptic literature, something of a foreign language to us. We're not very familiar with it and how it works. And so I have just found little tips along the way, just very helpful in making this book come alive. And so just sharing some of these with you. Hopefully they're helpful for you as well too. Question we're going after today, to put it as, I don't know, maybe simply and bluntly as I can. We've just finished up chapters 8 and 9. We saw these locusts, right, with their horse heads and their scorpion tails and their shields, whatever. So here's the question. These locusts, good guys or bad guys? Or, another way to put it, are these locusts sent from the hand of God to do His bidding and His will? Or are they sent from the hand of God's enemies, right? These spiritual forces of darkness that abide in the abyss, the bottomless pit, and are they sent to do their bidding? And really, I'm going after this bigger question, which I think is throughout this whole book here, right? Whereas we've been starting to see, okay, the seals unlocked and these trumpets blown, right? And the action that ensues on the back end of all this, right? It looks kind of destructive. And it looks kind of grim and morbid and grotesque. And so the question is, right, is this stuff, is this God's judgment upon His creation, right? Is this sent from His hand to judge His creation, His world, His people? Or is it the work of God's enemies, the spiritual forces of darkness, sort of raging against God and waging war against Him and His people in their creation? And I think the way you answer that question will play into how you view the book as a whole. Like, I think if you view them as fundamentally, well, these are acts of God's judgment, right? Because it seems like, well, they're coming from the heavenly throne room, or they're a result of His seals being popped open, or as a result of His heavenly angels coming and executing these things. So clearly they are God's judgment. Well, then probably you're going to have a very much a futuristic view of the book. And you're going to think of the book as just describing events that are yet to come, because you tend to think of right now not so much as the period of God's judgment and wrath upon His creation. Rather, this is the period of His mercy and His patience, where He's offering salvation through His Son to the world, and all that judgment and wrath upon those who reject that was stuff that will be yet to come. The problem is, I think that might be just a little bit simplistic in viewing these things. Yes, they come as a result of these seals being opened. Yes, they seem to emanate from the heavenly throne room and even involve some angelic characters, but yet I think it might be just a little bit overly simplistic to say, well then, so clearly, this is all God's judgment by itself. We could say it that way. And to get at this, I want to remind you of a couple of things that the book of Revelation wants to reveal to you. Again, that's what apocalypto means in the Greek. It means to reveal, and that's what apocalyptic literature does. It reveals things. And so one of the things the book of Revelation wants to reveal to you is the glory of God. Right? God in all of His sovereign authority, all of His resplendent glory, the God who is seated on the throne, who is the creator of all things, who executes sovereign authority over His creation. It wants to show you the Lamb, right? The conquering Lion of Judah, who has conquered the power of sin and death, and in His victory now has the authority to execute the plans and purposes of God in His creation for His kingdom. Okay? So it wants to show you that, and show you God in all of His glory, and invite you in, invite you into a life of worship of this God, right? Invite you into, these heavenly choirs that are all singing these great songs of praise and celebration to the one seated on the throne and unto the Lamb. Okay, but another thing the book of Revelation wants to reveal or pull back the curtain is to show you the desperate condition, the messed up condition of a life of sin. Right? It wants to show you some of the deeper dynamics, the deeper nature and of a life lived in rejection of the Creator, or a life lived worshiping some other God, right? A life lived in idolatry. right? And so it's going to reveal that and all of its depravity and all of its messed upness, right? So if you go back to like those 7 seals, when those first 4, few seals are open and out come the 4 riders of the apocalypse, right? They are in some way showing us what a world is going to look like that is plunged into sin, right? We would expect it's going to be a world of conquest, a world of warfare, a lack of peace, injustice, famine, and death. Which, by the way, would have made full sense, or which would have been helpful, I think, for the early church to hear, right? As the early church is suffering and experiencing hardship and trial, right? Here's just some of this explanation of what's going on, that a world rejecting its creator, a world intent on worshiping something else, is going to be a world where we're going to see a lot of conquest and violence and famine and injustice and all that. The second cycle, trumpets start blowing, and we see the wastefulness, the futility of a life lived worshiping other gods, right? We see their emptiness, and we see God's sovereign power over his creation in those trumpets 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then in trumpets 5 and 6, right, we made the case on Sunday that we're also being shown that idolatry, right, this business of worshiping these other gods, is also flirting with these forces of darkness who not only desire to pull you away from the living God, but who aim at nothing short of your torment and ultimate destruction. I think that's what's being revealed in those trumpets. Okay, but at the same time, Revelation, while it's showing sin and evil and violence and wickedness, right, doing its worst, and it's revealing the true colors of a life lived in sin and rejection of the Creator, at the same time, while all that's going on, at the same time, the book of Revelation is not going to, in a sense, pull God off the throne. Or it's not going to relent from this picture of God as being fully sovereign and fully executing his purposes and bringing his creation to its appointed end, even though you look around now and you just see sin and evil doing its worst. If you think about from the very beginning, and we've talked about this on Sunday mornings, this has been sort of this tension all throughout the book. In chapter 1, we're introduced to Jesus, who is the exalted king over all the kings of the earth. This Jesus who has triumphed over the power of death. This Jesus who holds in his hands the keys to death and Hades. And this Jesus who has made for himself, who has gathered his people and made them into a kingdom, right? And yet, also in chapter 1, John introduces himself as a participant with the church in the Great Tribulation. As he's writing from prison, right? As he's writing from this experience of trial and tribulation himself. And so there's that question from the very beginning. How is it that Christ is the exalted one, the king over all the kings of the earth, who's defeated the powers of sin and death, who has full authority to execute God's purposes and is establishing his kingdom, and yet the power of evil seems to rage against John and the church, and they're suffering as a result of it. How is Jesus on the throne and the church is suffering? So I guess what I'm saying here is that that conflict goes all throughout the book, and we would get ourselves into interpretive trouble if we ever make it an either or. That's if to say, well, if sin and evil are doing its worst, then Christ has relinquished the throne for a time, or has taken his hand off the wheel and is perhaps no longer sovereignly at work. No, the book of Revelation wants to show you both continuing for the time. Sin and evil, the powers of darkness, doing their worst, and yet somehow God is yet fully sovereign. And so somehow this is all part of God's plan and purposes. And so I think that is partly why you see these things happening as the seals are being opened and as these angels are blowing these trumpets. And at the same time, you would make an interpretive mistake if you all just attribute it to God sovereignly executing his purposes, and that the powers of evil and darkness and Satan and hell are not also at work in what's going on here. So point being, locusts, good guys or bad guys? Well, definitely bad guys coming from the abyss, coming from the hand of God's enemies. But yet God is fully on the throne, executing his sovereign plan and purposes, bringing about, right? So there's this tension. I would also just say to you here real quick, as you're reading this and trying to make some sense of this and apply this, when we talk about God's sovereignty or the sovereignty of Christ, you want to think about that as he is the one who, in his victory, is going to bring about the plan and purposes of God in salvation and new creation and judgment. He is going to bring these things to pass. He is going to bring these things about, and nothing is going to get in the way. Nothing is going to stop him. Right? If we take Jesus off the throne, then the whole plan is thrown into question. Will we ever get to the glorious end that's coming? Will the church that is suffering ever find relief? Okay, but the point here, just simply saying, when we talk about the sovereignty of Christ and the sovereignty of God, what we mean in the book of Revelation is that he still retains full control and is thus going to bring it to his appointed end, though all his enemies rage against him and are trying to do their worst. Okay? Another quick thing I might say to our question here is that part of judgment is this business of revealing the full depravity of sin and evil and wickedness. That's part of what it means to judge. It means to expose, to declare what is right and what is wrong, and to declare that before the whole world. And so part of God's judgment might be like just letting sin and evil do its worst so that you see it for what it is. That's maybe a little bit speculative, so I don't want to go too far down that road. I will say this also, that we haven't seen so much of this yet, but it's coming. There is something of a purpose to why God is allowing this evil and violence and powers of darkness to persist. There is it has a role to play, yet in his purposes of not only judgment, but also redemption and salvation, and we're going to see that yet to come. It could just be, just to give you a little bit of hint, that God is allowing these things to do their worst as a means of exhausting its power and perhaps ultimately flipping its power on its head, using the power of evil and death against itself to ultimately destroy it and bring about his new creation, which, by the way, I would just say, he's done this before, hasn't he? All right, think about what the cross is. The cross is both perhaps the greatest evil the world has ever known, as the innocent Son of God is bearing the full weight of the sins of the world and it is crushing him into death. And probably at that moment, the enemies of God were just salivating, right? Thinking that they have accomplished this great victory. And yet what is really happening? Well, one, it's the greatest good also that the world has ever known, in that God is accomplishing salvation. It's the greatest advancement of his kingdom, right, that the world has ever seen. And it's God flipping the power of sin and death on itself and using it to triumph over his enemies. I want to say it could be that a similar dynamic is going to play out in God's purposes for his church, which is yet to come, but we'll get there when we get there. It's coming up shortly here in chapters 10 and 11. So stay tuned. That's all I got for today. Just keep those two things in mind. Revelation, revealing sovereign glory and authority of God and the Lamb. At the same time, revealing the full depravity of sin, powers of darkness, and a life lived entertaining all that, worshiping all that, desiring all that. So we want to stay as far away from that as we possibly can. And there you go. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. Thanks.